To get started today, we should review a bit. So last week we talked about how structural factors impact the social health of young people, focusing on how economic conditions contribute to intergenerational poverty. We talked about how equality, social mobility, and education provide a way out of this poverty trap, and in turn a way for folks from economically disadvantaged backgrounds to escape the negative effects of poverty on health. This week we are going to address closely related social barriers, primarily by considering the impact of race, ethnicity, and nationality on health. As we do, it should be of course readily apparent that race and ethnicity are not the only social factors that contribute to social barriers. In truth, any factor that creates social distinctions, such as class, sexual orientation, culture, and so on, have the potential to create barriers to health care. With the case of race and ethnicity, it is useful first to disentangle what it is we are considering. After all, if you track back generations and throughout our genealogies, you'll find that all humans share a recent common ancestor as little as 15,000 years ago. Of course, we know from our social experiences that humans do not treat each other as one big happy family. To help us understand where this othering comes from, there is a useful concept known as haplogroup. Haplogroups are groups of individuals with similar haplotypes that share a common ancestral linkage, usually dating back just a few thousand years. These haplotypes are genes inherited from a single parent due to mutations that occurred along the way. Therefore, haplogroups can be considered a sort of roadmap that allows us to understand how we are to relate to one another. When you chart back far enough, the oldest haplogroups in which migrated are those which migrated to southern Africa about 60,000 years ago. But as time moves on, there begin to develop branches in haplogroups as humans migrate out of the African continent into Australia, East Asia, and even North America. Eventually, a series of smaller migrations, each a new haplogroup, can be seen emerging into the Middle East, all tracked through genetic linkages of individuals. And then about 30,000 years ago, you start to see that the Middle East and Africa begin to have their own ancestral and haplogroup lineages. Within just about 20,000 years, haplogroups move into Western Europe, and then as we continue, they multiply through a second wave into the New World in South America, which occurred as little as 10,000 years ago. Those ancestral linkages are important because they connect genetic factors to locations, places where new cultures and traditions can develop. Importantly, however, particularly when we are talking about race and ethnicity, this connection between people and their land also gives rise to changes in the physical appearances associated with each haplogroup. These random mutations start to create genetic distinctions, such as the decreased production of melanin among those living outside the tropics. As melanin contributes to darkening of skin, we see that over time, within the past few thousand years, that differences in skin tones start to emerge based on the latitude at which. And in turn, what were merely migratory differences in the human species evolved into cultural and biological ones, with race becoming strongly associated with where people are from. Of course, this raises an important question whether race is a biological construct or a social one. After all, two predominantly genetic or biological phenomena promote these sorts of changes we describe as genetic drift. The first is bottlenecking, which occurs when a population size is dramatically reduced and the remaining genetic diversity is restricted, thus altering the fundamental genetic dynamics from which a gene pool recovers. And the second is a founder effect, wherein the non-representative distribution of characteristics of those migrating out of an area creates a new set of constraints on the genetic distribution of traits. So this would seem to suggest that race is a valid biological construct. However, when comparing skin tones to the genetic characteristics of an individual, you can see that very dark skin tones, there is strong relationship with genes, but for lighter skin tones, skin tone is a less accurate predictor of race. In other words, skin tone is not necessarily a helpful biological indicator of any particular genetic occurrence. Furthermore, as you can see in the figure on the left, there is a strong correlation in haplotype frequency among African and European Americans. This means that haplogroups do not strongly differentiate ancestry in the Americas. There are a lot of migratory overlap. This idea is reinforced in Figure 2, where we can see that genetic diversity within a race is often greater than the genetic diversity between races, indicated by the two overlapping distributions there. In other words, if you were to pick two individuals at random, race would not be an accurate predictor of how similar they were genetically. In fact, of the 0.1% of genetic variation between two randomly selected humans, only about 5 to 10% of this is racial. The rest is continental segregation, and a whopping 80 to 90% is just individual variation, has nothing to do with race. And so, when we think about this, the terms we use, race isn't always the most helpful. Oftentimes, instead, we like to think of things in terms of ethnicity or nationality. The term ethnicity was first used in the 1940s when biological notions of race were discredited in the immediate post-hoc Holocaust era. In fact, as a side note, race first emerged only a few centuries earlier as a way to persecute European Jews as a distinct racial category. Ruling families for the first time connected blood inheritance to social or cultural groups as they sought to prove their quote-unquote Jewish-free bloodline. Anyhow, ethnicity is often used interchangeably with race, or else compounded as race/ethnicity, in a way that obscures or narrows the meaning of each individual term. Some scholars define ethnicity as a self-chosen category reflecting ancestry, culture, religion, language, and geographic location relevant to a particular time. Race, on the other hand, often refers to the conferred identities that are based on imagined hierarchies of human value related to phenotypes, skin color, and other supposed biological expressions of group inferiority. Nevertheless, it is important to note that many Canadians utilize the terms race, ethnicity, as well as immigration and culture imprecisely, using one term instead of the other, or using the terms interchangeably. As some have noted, this mixed approach to terminology has occurred largely because National Population Health Survey and the Canadian Community Health Survey, which are two large national health surveys conducted by Statistics Canada, on which much of the research on health equity is based, collect data on what they term as racial/cultural identity, thus conflating these incommensurate concepts. Furthermore, the term immigrant is a particularly problematic identifier in the context of health inequalities. While more than 75% of immigrants who have arrived in Canada since 2001 are considered by Statistics Canada as quote-unquote visible minorities, few studies distinguish between white and European immigrants and immigrants of color. As a consequence of the imprecise use of these terms, much of Canadian research on immigrant health has been less than useful. So, in review, when we think about race and ethnicity, we really need to distinguish between race, ethnicity, ancestry, nationality, and other terms that are related to these, and pay closer attention to the way that these factors intersect with one another. On the slide now, you can see a few of our kind of standard definitions distinguishing these factors. As we do so, we need to remember that race, while not a particularly useful biological construct, does not explain much of the health differences between individuals. Yet, this is not to say that race, ethnicity, and ancestry, and so on, do not play an important role in health. In Canada, the social determinants of health approach has helped us to understand exactly how ethnicity and these other factors impact health outcomes for disadvantaged populations. Social determinants of health approaches have been important contributions to the contextualization of health inequalities, arguing that their origins must be understood beyond the framework of individual health barriers. However, theories that foreground the link between inequitable distribution of social resources and unfair exposure to health reducing conditions have been recently criticized for ignoring their non-economic, that is, the social and structural manifestations of racism that are part of the larger picture of health inequalities. A social determinants of health approach, however, well-meaning, conveys the impression that across ethnic groups, across countries, and across outcomes, socioeconomic factors contribute to ethnic inequalities in health. However, these data also raise the possibility that socioeconomic inequalities cannot fully explain the ethnic inequalities of health. For most groups and for most outcomes, differences remain even after adjusting for socioeconomic indicators. In other words, these social factors including race, are important and independent of the socioeconomic indicators that we talked about last week. Yet, it is important to note that not every difference in health can be explained by a race and discrimination. Health inequalities are defined as systematic, potentially avoidable differences in health, or in the major socially determined influences on health between groups of people who have different relative positions in social hierarchies according to health, power, and prestige. Because these differences adversely affect the health or health risks of groups already at a disadvantage by virtue of their underlying social positions, they are particularly unfair. Researchers have identified numerous pathways to health inequities related to racism, including the psychological stress of living in a racist environment, unequal economic opportunities, inequitable access to education and other social resources, lack of adequate housing, exposure to environmental toxins, engagement in risky sexual behavior or other health behaviors, victimization through the social trauma such as spousal or sexual abuse, and other forms of violence, of course, but also extend to things like the mistrust in the healthcare system and the underutilization of screening programs. While many of these pathways are directly related to poverty, even economically well-off members of racialized groups may be exposed to psychological stress and distress and other economic forces endemic to racially unequal societies. Thus, we must distinguish between these sorts of differences that are simply based on clinical appropriateness of preferences and those which are based on disparities or outright discrimination. Of course, in Canada, we are often tempted to ignore the role race plays, assuming that the universal healthcare system is equally accessible to all. As such, you'll find that much of the data on racial disparities comes from the United States. This is particularly true when it comes to data on youth and young adults. Yet, evidence of racial inequalities generally in Canada is substantial. In the United States, for example, with data specific to youth, we can see that reviews suggest that the minority youth experience increased odds of suboptimal health status, being overweight, asthma, activity limitations, behavior and speech problems, emotional difficulties, a lack of insurance coverage, suboptimal dental health, no usual source of health care, unmet medical and dental needs, transportation barriers to care, problems getting specialty care, no medical or dental visits in the past year, emergency department visits, not receiving mental health care, not receiving prescription medications. Of course, these differences vary by group, with different minority groups experiencing different problems. Nevertheless, taken all together, systematic reviews controlling for socioeconomic status suggest that minority youth receive fewer primary care visits, as reported by 8 out of 12 studies in a review, and fewer mental health services, as reported out of 6 out of 9 studies. You can also see that when it comes to life expectancy, racial disparities in life longevity have persisted over time, with consistently higher life expectancy among whites, which are represented by the yellow bars here in this graph, as compared to minority groups. So let's take a case study for a moment on something like obesity. We know that obesity is determined by many behavioral and environmental factors, including those which rise in the earliest years of childhood. Data from the United States shows that differences in pregnancy-related risk factors for child obesity differ across ethnic groups. In one national study, for instance, Black and Hispanic women were more likely than white women to begin their pregnancies already overweight or obese and gain less weight during pregnancy. Another study found that Hispanic women have a higher risk of gestational diabetes, and while a few studies have examined racial and ethnic differences in smoking during pregnancy or in maternal antenatal depression, a recent study showed that racial and ethnic differences in risk factors for obesity exist prenatally and in early childhood. In studies, children from underrepresented racial ethnic groups are found to have higher risk for various obesity risk factors compared with their white counterparts. Specifically, Black and Hispanic children had higher odds of antenatal depression, weight gain during infancy, introduction of solid foods before 4 months of age, maternal restrictive feeding, television in their bedrooms after age 2, and intake of sugar-sweetened beverages and fast food. Conversely, Black and Hispanic children had lower odds of protective factors, including exclusive breastfeeding and sleep for more than 12 hours per day during infancy. These findings help to explain disparities in early childhood obesity rates, while justifying the need for early childhood interventions that reduce these disparities. Meanwhile, several studies of older children have found that obesity-related risk factors are also more prevalent among racial, ethnic, minority youth. Previous studies have found higher levels of TV viewing and more televisions in the bedroom, higher consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, increased fast food consumption, and lower levels of physical activity among ethnic youth compared to white youth. And so now it's tempting to say that these differences are largely attributable to social class. After all, socioeconomic status is a multidimensional construct that is known to exert a profound influence on health. Yet, as noted earlier, differences persist in racial disparities even after adjusting for these factors, like parental income or educational attainment. And so, given that persist even after accounting for these fully explain ethnic differences, that even across education prevalence, increased attention minorities are persistently cultural and their culturalization as underlying factors that may contribute specifically white school, white high school dropouts, live on average has shown that 1 year's longer. A change in health status minority occurs the longer people white college grads live on average 4.2 years. In particular, studies have shown minority college grads, and so. Thinking about some of the factors that contribute to increased morbidity and mortality, we first note the effect of cardiovascular disease. Now, this data is focused on Canada. So in thinking about the disparities that exist, you can think about like South Asian people experiencing high rates of cardiovascular disease in Canada and throughout the world. This is a well-documented phenomena. For example, the South Asian populations in Canada have the highest rate of ischemic heart disease, which is defined as a lack of blood flow and oxygen to the heart muscle. This condition is caused by narrowing of the arteries, causing less blood and oxygen to reach the heart muscle, which may in fact lead to a heart attack. Deaths from cardiovascular disease are significantly more frequent in Canadians of South Asian origin than in Canadians of European origin, with 42% of South Asian men and 29% of South Asian women diagnosed with the disease, as compared to only 29% of European men and 19% of European women, European origin women. These dramatic statistics have prompted much speculation as to the origins of the phenomena, which include theories centered on the genetic makeup of South Asians. But as some have convincingly argued, quote, racial disparities in the vast majority of chronic health conditions have little to do with genetic differences. Biology's major role, after all, is to define the array of possible physiological responses to the social, economic, and environmental conditions associated with increased risk for morbidity and mortality. Therefore, adverse social conditions can evoke physiological responses through what they call the allostatic system, which is normally thought to, hopes to kind of sit in equilibrium. But the price that is exacted by responding to adverse social or environmental conditions of the life cycle that contribute to increased allostatic load create wear and tear on the body, causing damage to heart muscles and other organs, important organs of that sustain human life. So the prolonged activation of this allostatic system in turn predisposes people to chronic as well as infectious diseases. Taking cancer as another example, a 2011 study of the incidence of cancer among immigrants to Canada offers a relatively comprehensive picture of the status of disease among racialized immigrants. Utilizing 4 national databases, including the Canadian Human Mortality Database and the Canadian Cancer Database, the study concluded that, with the exception of some liver cancers, the incidence ratio was lower for immigrants than that for the Canadian born population. However, among immigrants in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, the incidence of liver cancer in particular is significantly elevated. Cervical cancer rates among refugee women as well, age 45 to 64, have been found higher among racialized immigrants and minorities. This may be related to low rates of pap smear screening among refugee women and possibly higher rates of human papillomavirus, which is a well-documented link to a cervical cancer. And so you can imagine that for other cancers as well, there is a racialized effect. Kind of moving on to occupational environmental illnesses, we all know that workers, from workers' compensation data, that immigrants and racialized people are exposed to distinct environmental and occupational health problems. Racialized people, after all, are more likely to work as manual laborers or laborers in factory settings, which poses significantly higher risks for injury and environmental exposure. Again, featuring the health of South Asian Canadians, some studies have shown that South Asians are 3 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes than European white Canadians. One study found that the overall incidence of diabetes among South Asians is between 12 and 15%, compared to only between 3 and 5% among European descended Canadians. And finally, of course, a number of studies in recent years have dealt with the mental health status of racialized communities. These studies have repeatedly, again and again, shown that experiences with racism, trauma, and discrimination have a deleterious effect on mental health of populations, and particularly on young people, with much of the research being conducted specifically to look at young people's experiences of trauma and groups, including indigenous people, likewise experience dramatically high rates of HIV and AIDS. While some of this is related to issues such as access to care and the network dynamics of HIV transmission, historical injustices through colonization are known to be contributing factors. So when we think about some of the mechanisms and domination have often been used as a source of justification to highlight among them, indigenous peoples and their resources kind of concept through racialization and colonialism. Racialization is reinforced because it highlights the social process qualities people are made to be kind of quote-unquote other. Another way to think of this sort of power imbalance discussed here is the idea of kyriarchy. It is likely that you've heard of patriarchy, but kyriarchy takes male domination and applies it to language bias, educationalism or elitism, racism, Eurocentrism, heterosexism, ableism, ageism, politics of appearance, natalism, classism, genderism, colorism, anti-Semitism, androcentrism, all these sort of sources of social distinction based largely on identity characteristics. So understanding how these many characters intersect is really fundamental to understanding how social barriers come to impact individuals, as well as the privileges that others experience. As I'm sure you can readily understand, young people whose identities are associated with these marginalized characteristics are bound to experience the negative health consequences of these power injustices. And so when it comes to race, some of the pathways by which these inequalities impact health, Nancy Krieger identifies 6, which are listed on this slide. They include economic and social deprivation, exposure to toxic substances and hazardous conditions, socially inflicted traumas, targeting of addictive and harmful foods and substances, inadequate health care, and attacks on the fundamental sources of resilience that minority people would otherwise have. And so thinking about the terms of specific policies and experiences that contribute to poorer health among racialized groups, experiences of discrimination, racism, over-policing of their communities, and segregation have had really a profound effect on shaping kind of health systems and how they work with minority communities. And so let's take on racism first. Racism can be either kind of overt and obvious, such as hate crimes or just like poor treatment of people of color, but it can also be covert and and structural. It can making it go kind of undetected. A lot of folks report that we live in an equal society, that racism doesn't exist, but often that's because when people conceptualize racism, is what they're thinking about is those overt forms of racism, when things like implicit bias in the way we design policies and how we relate to one another based on a race, those can have implicit and unseen effects. So we have seen again and again that racism is linked with poor health outcomes, particularly among youth. So when we think of racism, we have to remember that what it comes down to is how we other people, however that othering ends up looking like, if it's internal or externally kind of presented. Research on in-group and out-group identification shows that out-groups can be characterized on a two-factor scale of warmth and competence. Groups that are high in warmth and high in competence usually constitute groups like college students and the middle class, those who are kind of part of the in-group. Meanwhile, those who are perceived as incompetent and cold on the opposite of the diagonal are treated with disgust, as is the case of welfare recipients, homeless people, oftentimes groups who we've systematically disadvantaged end up in that category. And then those who are perceived as competent and cold attract our envy, and those who are perceived as warm and incompetent attract our pity. In each circumstance, the in-group and out-group dynamics that are determined by our perceptions have a profound impact on how we treat one another. So when racism is acted upon, it becomes discrimination. And like racism, experiences of discrimination have again and again and again been linked to poor health outcomes. Two reviews featured above here show that in more than 100 studies, experiences of discrimination have been associated with worse mental, sexual, physical health, less healthcare access, greater disease severity, and greater engagement in risk behaviors. As one of many forms of discrimination, segregation has had a profound impact on the health of young people and their communities. It can impact access to healthy foods, green space, healthcare services, but also access to quality public schooling and some of those upstream structural factors that we talked about last week. Segregation has been described as, quote unquote, the linchpin of U.S. race relations and the dominant system of racial regulation and control. Others have called it the missing link in an effort to understand urban poverty. So you can see that there's this compounding, reinforced interaction between social factors and structural ones. A good example of that within the context of segregation is the way that it impacts young people through over-policing. In the words of Warren Buffett, who's a famous kind of guru, stock market guru, he once said, if cops follow you for 500 miles, you're going to get a ticket, right? They're eventually going to see you do something wrong. So in Canada, over-policing has had a profound impact on Indigenous and other minority communities. So take, for instance, the residential school program, the 60s Scoop, in which children were taken from their parents, the drug war in which minorities are nickeled and dimed or worse, imprisoned for petty drug offenses. All of these factors are social really problems in that the over-policing or overactive intervention on behalf of governments leads to a really degrading of minority communities. In turn, minorities experience at the hands of their government harsher sentencing, more of their behaviors are criminalized or considered suspicious, minorities are more likely to be suspended from school. It really starts to get a bit hopeless when you think about all the ways in which minorities are disadvantaged compared to those with social capital and power. And so when it comes to our public health response, I would like to highlight three key strategies to overcome the litany of ways in which minority health is degraded through social oppression. The kind of first of these is through providing culturally competent care. While many reviews find that there is not that it's not so important if experiences of accessing healthcare are culturally competent for those who are accessing care, it is recognized as a key factor in determining whether or not somebody comes back for care or enters care in the first place. And that's where culturally competent care can really be thought to improve a better job because it ensures that people engage better. The second thing we must do is better target healthcare systems by promoting health equity. In the words of Plato, there is nothing so unfair as the equal treatment of unequal people. This is because there is a fundamental difference between equality and equity. As I'm sure some of you have heard before, equity means treating people such that you account for their differences, whereas equality means you simply treat everyone as the same. In a system that is tilted against minorities, action must be taken to overcome that system. You can't just treat people the same. So finally, you must address racism and discrimination head-on. Indeed, the in-group and out-group dichotomies that have to be lessonized they have to be minimized, have to be lessened by eliminating those hierarchical differences between people based on their races, focusing on shared goals of individuals and communities, bringing people together kind of on equal terms such that everyone feels respected and treated with dignity, and encouraging people not to think of others as some amorphous horde, but to focus on them as individuals who are worthy of dignity and worthy of respect, just like we feel that we are. In other words, public health must focus not only on addressing the basic needs of young people, but must focus on the higher order psychological needs, such as being loved and belonging, having a healthy self-esteem, and realizing our full potential. While these needs are addressed and addressed equitably, only then and then will we kind of overcome the class distinctions that divide us. And this is important for all kind of the reasons we've talked about so far in the course when addressing youth, because early life experiences with self-esteem and self-actualization, feeling belonging and feeling love, those have a profound effect, not just during this period of our lives, but kind of forward and moving and looking at our long-term health outcomes. And so that's kind of all there is for this week. Now, I will say that there are a few things that we should, of course, follow up on. So you should be kind of wrapping up your literature search for your systematic review and beginning to extract pieces of information from your studies so that you can evaluate their quality. Your TAs will be reviewing how to do this in tutorials. If you have not gotten to this point, I just want to remind you that you're kind of falling a bit behind, and I strongly encourage you to take time during reading week and this week to catch up, in addition to preparing for the exam, which is after reading week during our next lecture. And so format of the exam is about 20 questions. It's a varied question types. Everything from lectures is fair game. And so with that, I hope that you have a nice break during reading week, and stay safe and warm.